Welcome to the Pure Property Podcast. Whether you are considering buying your first investment property or reaching property mogul status, we dissect the fundamentals through to large-scale property development and everything in between.
How's it going? Phil Tarrant. I am the co-host of this podcast. This charade of a podcast, I'm told.
Who buying?
Get some people on there that know what they're talking about.
Well,
Not Paul Glossop from Pure Property Investment on the
Not
Pure
the
Property
co-host, Phil
Investment
Tarrant.
podcast. No, it's they want more. The punters want more, and I said there's no more to give. Once a month is enough of Paul Glossop on this podcast.
Fair enough.
It's fair enough, isn't it?
No, well, that's why we've got other guests in here.
With this, yeah. Bring the real talent in. We'll get to that shortly. But what's been happening?
Plenty. I just got sent an article from a client of mine from the AFR this morning, essentially proclaiming that Perth is at its heyday again, and talking all things boom, no things bust, which sometimes makes you a bit nervous when you start to see the mainstream newspapers get on board. But not to say that Perth's the only place that we're buying or people should be considering buying, but there is plenty of positive sentiment coming out of the market. Who'd have thunk it though, Phil, when we've been talking about this for 2 years?
It's crazy, isn't it?
Well, yeah, for some it might be, but I think we've sort of got to this point where the good buying conditions are certainly still here, but we're certainly only, I think, a matter of months, not years away from cash starting to become a little bit more available, and typically means that people start to think about what happens when I can get more money. Property typically is one of those things which starts to become a little bit more accessible and starts to go up in value, which lo and behold, that's what's been happening for probably the last 8 to 10 months. In some cases, hasn't stopped since the GFC.
This is it. And you saw the numbers come out today from CoreLogic, 1.3%, 1.6%, I
Yep.
can't remember, 1.3%.
1.3.
1.3% for the March quarter growth, which is expected.
Yeah.
It's just the way.
It's on a tear.
This way it works. But you talk about Perth, and it'd be remiss of me because I get in trouble if I don't talk about your book, The Surfer's Guide to Property Investment. Use a surfing term. Nah, mate, you missed it. You should have been here yesterday.
It should have been here yesterday.
Is that Perth?
I don't think so.
No?
I think
Is it still going off?
Well, I mean, you sort of look at Sydney too right now, hey? I mean, we've all bought, everyone in this studio, it was behind these desks, is bought in Sydney. You could have said the same thing about that. We could have said the same thing about Brizzy. We could have said the same thing about Adelaide, Hobart, Perth now. If I stopped buying in Sydney in 2012-13 when I started buying in Sydney in the investment portfolio, I would have missed out on a lot back then because I didn't get that 2 or 3 years of that massive uptake towards 2015-16. But when it comes down to it, the cash flow is still good, so the hold is still very comfortable.
So when are you going to stop buying in Perth? You're not going to tell anyone.
That's a good question.
Yeah, when are you going to stop? When are you going to know it's time to stop buying in Perth?
When somewhere else supersedes the opportunity.
And that doesn't exist at the moment because we just did that Fast 50 report. And only half the suburbs are in Perth, and that was for where to put your money today for the best capital growth.
Correct.
2025.
In 2025, correct. And we're looking at a broader horizon. But I think for anyone who maybe has 2 or 3 assets, maybe a bit more in the Perth market, that might be potentially an opportunity to start to pivot and look elsewhere. And there's certainly other markets that we're buying in. Certain pockets of Sydney we're buying in. Certain pockets of Melbourne/Victoria we're buying in. Still buying in pockets of Brisbane. So, is Perth the only market we're buying in? Absolutely not. Is it a market that you need to be worried about getting out at the right time? I don't think it's that conversation either. It's not like we're buying in Port Hedland or Moranbah or Emerald. These aren't one-trick pony mining towns where all of a sudden you start to become very scared that, hey, it's really toppy if I don't get out now, or think of it if I buy now that I'm in a high risk territory. And the banks' LVR position and their comfort level is there. It's our 4th largest city in Australia, and essentially sits at 2.25 million people. That's not changing.
No, a lot of people compare Perth with Brisbane and talk about disparity of those markets. Back in the day, back in the halcyon days of Perth, a decade or so ago when a lot of people purchased at the top of the market, it was pretty much comparable with Sydney.
It was. It's only a few grand off.
Yeah, and now it's very, very different proposition. So a lot of people sort of benchmark it going, it should be at least where Brizzy is, maybe a little bit more, but whether that's the right thing to do. But do you think most people are attracted to the Perth, and sort of a bit off script, but it's important, because of the price points. So if you had, let's say, you could buy a medium price home in Sydney, right? 1.3 million bucks.
Yep.
So if you could buy 1.3 million bucks in Sydney or 1.3 million bucks in Perth,
Yep.
one asset, what would you do?
I wouldn't buy one asset in Perth.
So what'd you buy?
I'd buy two.
Two.
I'd have to. I couldn't.
So would you do two assets in Perth over
Correct.
one in Sydney?
Correct. Right now, I would. Yeah, with maybe the intention to say 3 to 5 years, I might liquidate one and take a bit of that exposure off the table. But right now, and the data, and you just mentioned the CoreLogic data out there will support this hands down. If anyone wants to go and grab that, they can probably jump on CoreLogic's website and have a look through. But the data will also suggest that as that bottom 25% decile range is performing better than any other range in Australia when you look at the actual cohort of properties. So Perth is one of those markets which $650,000 for that 1.3 mil total that you're talking about. It gets you a decent property in a decent location with a really good yield. And in a location that's probably seen 10, 15, 20, could even be up towards 30% capital growth in the last 12 months, but still only tracking probably 20 or 30% above its previous peak of circa 2013. Okay. So the difference between that and buying one freestanding house in Sydney, absolutely, I couldn't justify buying one $1.3 million property in Perth or Brisbane for that matter right now either, personally speaking.
Okay, well, there you got it. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about real-world investment. Now, you're the head of strategy and CEO of Pure Property Investment. But what I didn't understand is that you've got someone who's probably greater capability that probably does more of the work than what you do, property strategist and buyer's agent, Pure Property Investment, Aaron Findlay, joining us in the studio. So he's the guy that does all the work. Is that right, Aaron? Is that for you?
Some of it, yeah.
So when you call up whatever your phone number is, or go to your
1300 985 428.
There you go. You can't miss it. You can't miss the opportunity. Say it again so people would actually
1300 985 428.
Well, why don't you get like a 4811111 or something or other?
I don't think those numbers exist anymore.
Yeah.
Pizza Hut delivery.
You deliver pizzas, right?
I did indeed.
I deliver pizzas.
You did too,
Do you deliver pizzas? No.
No.
What jobs did you have when you were younger, Aaron?
I worked at a sports shop called Sports Scene. At,
I do remember Sports Scene
at Bankstown.
Yeah, Bankstown Square. That was good, between footy training and school. So that was good fun.
You're just like what, selling football boots and
a lot of jerseys and gear,
stocking shelves.
Stocking shelves.
So I was more of a Peter Wins. They're on Para. Para Mall.
That's way too far away from me. Getting to the Parramatta Mall.
I remember Sterlo. Sterlo used to have a shop on
really?
On Boomerang Crescent in Sevo.
There you go. Yeah. What was he flogging back in the day?
Same stuff.
Same stuff.
Yeah, it's just like
anything you can put his name
jerseys
to.
And
sign an occasional card out the front. No doubt.
He loved
trading
it,
cards.
mate. It's this back when Dave was. So that was your. So you were a footy player.
I was playing league, back at the time. So played league for 20 years and then transitioned to Aussie rules in my late 20s and played a fair bit of that till probably late 30s as well. So, always played sport.
Some sort of sport.
Yeah.
And now you're a buyer's agent.
Yeah.
Gee, how far
Been
you've
that
come.
for a long time. I think that was in addition to.
Yeah. So before you're a buyer's agent, we'll get into that, but what did you do before you were a buyer's agent?
I was a political advisor.
Oh, okay.
So just a
Who for?
Just a small pivot.
State or federal?
Senator. So
okay.
Federal. Yeah. So
are you going to disclose who it was? No.
No, I reckon we'll keep it impartial.
Okay, that's all right. I'm curious
because I know where you're going to go with this.
Yeah. Okay.
You're going to hijack it.
Well, I've got a beef with some of the decision making at the moment. I like the government. Government's cool.
Depends which one.
No, I just think that some of the stupidity and the commentary around housing right now really needs to be reined in. It's not beneficial, I think. Anyway, if we can chat about that later. So if I call up Pure Property Investment at whatever the number was, 481-101.
I'd be curious to know what happens when you call that number these days. I wonder if they've got a call diversion. As you're talking,
I think it's still the Pizza Hut number.
Really?
I reckon it's still the Pizza Hut number.
I can't believe
and this
Pizza
goes
Hut.
to the point around having a really good phone number. It's got to be. Put it up on our number.
Your call couldn't be.
No, really?
481 1111. No, they're not there.
Yeah,
they couldn't get a call.
9481
They did.
111.
948111. Let's try that again.
I reckon it's Pizza
Sit tight,
Hut.
people.
It'd be
We're
Pizza Hut North
wasting
City. Pizza Hut
quality
North City.
people's airtime right now.
Welcome to Pizza a heart.
Anyway, so when you call up Pure Property Investment and you find a time to chat with someone, it's either going to be one of you two.
Yeah.
Is that
hands
pretty
down,
much how
that
it
is
works?
exactly it.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
And it probably goes back to our modus operandi as a company is that, speak to Aaron, speak to myself, speak to Lena, speak to Gerald, speak to Courtney, speak to Debbie, speak to Kim, speak to anyone. Regardless of who they're speaking to, they're going to speak to someone who has invested in property. In some cases, a lot of property. Certainly from Aaron's case, from my case, as investors have been investing for a very long period of time and actively buy property basically almost on a daily basis. So experience for us is everything. You won't be speaking to someone who hasn't probably for almost all of our clients hasn't been in some way, shape or form where they are or where they want to get to or hasn't experienced some part of a market in a certain price point with a certain strategy in mind and a certain objective.
And
so
do you think that you obviously
myself.
think it's important?
I think personally it's important, and that's probably why we've set it up the way we have. Is that if we want to set a strategy, if we want to get an outcome, if we want to essentially align people to certain areas, to certain markets, we can't do it without experience, in my opinion. And that's sort of where we are right now. Is that we've got decades and decades of experience, but in particular, the people who are setting the strategy and the criterias should have that.
Been there, done that.
100%.
Probably made all the mistakes.
Yeah.
So on that basis, then let's establish your bona fides to the point around, well, if you're going to sort of use Pure Property as someone to help you with this stuff, that the people who are doing it for you do it themselves. So you're a property investor. Do you have a large portfolio? I guess am I allowed to ask you about numbers?
Of course.
Okay.
I'd say compared to some of your distinguished guests on here, I've got a mid-sized portfolio. Overall value about 10.5 million. Debt position about 6.5. So about 62% loan to value, including the principal place as well.
Yep.
Rents would be 380 to 400,000 per annum. So probably about a 6%, gross yield on debt position at the moment. So,
okay.
Having strong yields is always something that's important, but not at the expense of having future upside as well. So there's definitely some properties in there. There's a good half a dozen there that have got, either sort of medium to high density zoning, but they've all got good yields as well. So I'm not under any pressure to get them rezoned or do anything active.
So you can do something with them, but you don't need to do something with them.
Correct.
So just as standalone, despite the zoning or the upside, they could just sit there and tick away.
Yeah,
and you could sell them off as to some other investor as potential development stuff. Yeah.
And I have done that. There have been a couple of instances where I've had an asset that's seen some really good growth. Potentially the yield wasn't quite there, so I've just been able to dispose of that, as long as it's in the right entity like a trust or something like that, take some profit off the table and reinvest it into something that also has development potential but a much higher yield and potentially like a dual income duplex sort of property as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're happy with your portfolio?
Yeah, I think, I always like to use the Tom Brady analogy. They'd ask him about his Super Bowls, and it was always what's your favourite one? Well, the next one. So I'm always looking for value. So I'm in a pretty sort of heavy accumulation phase. When that will end, I don't really know. But I just like to seek out value and find it. And when I find something, I move pretty quickly. So yes, I'm happy with it, but always trying to improve as well.
That's fair enough. That's most property investors I know sort of say the same thing, right? There's nothing perfect about the portfolio. It's like the plumber who has, the fact that they probably still need to refit all the pipes in their home, right? It's
and you're only one phone call away typically from a property manager telling you something about a property that you own from being unhappy about a property for a finite period of time until you're happy again, and then everything goes back into smooth sailing territory. And
100%.
That's all right. So $10.5 million in value, including your principal place residence, $6.5 million in debt, 60% sort of LVR. How many properties in your portfolio? Not that it matters, but how many are in there?
So 14 investment properties.
Yep.
But 3 of those are duplexes as well. So you sort of add a few more doors onto that essentially.
So you got 17 rents coming out. Okay.
Yeah.
And do you count doors or you count assets? It doesn't really matter.
Probably just assets, I think. I think as I get further down the track, and I may start to add, things with, maybe 4 or 5 incomes, and that situation might change, progress to unit blocks and things like that. It might become more of a door scenario, but I think as it is at the moment, it's probably more just properties, I think. Yeah.
Well, what a lot of people don't know is that you actually bought me a unit block once upon a time, before you joined Principal Place to Residence, when you were working with another crew.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do remember it was like a bit of a blind auction sort of scenario, like a multiple offer sort of thing. And I think I put in some sort of odd 999,600 or something like that, trying to beat your, faceless competition. So.
Fun fact, Philip, we also bid on that same property.
Oh.
Which would have been sitting next to me,
Yeah. Which you end up buying, which we were trying to buy for another client, which
really?
we didn't.
I didn't know about that.
No, because we found this out through separate conversations.
Really?
So
We
Lena,
bought that ages ago.
about 6-7 years ago. Lena Lindley, who is our senior buyer's agent.
She think we overpaid.
Well, you ask her. We'll get her on here at one stage, and I'm sure she will. But we did have an offer on I think we were about 980 from memory, somewhere there or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And we didn't buy it.
No.
You did.
Yeah.
Which is probably
We paid 10 grand more. Wow.
And wow. And
I'm so happy
to that
I
point,
did
this
that.
this isn't going to be a podcast about how wealthy you are now, but it also is also a podcast about lesson learned. Sometimes you got to pay a price at a time. If you can afford to hold it, time will work the rest out. And that property's done very well. It's probably seen circa 60, 70, 80% growth in the last 6 or 7 years, and gives you a very good yield on it as well. But it was probably a good lesson for anyone who's prepared to buy and hold.
And it's unstrutted, and there's upside around it, and
you can
smack
do
bang
all
in the
kinds
middle of a
of different
town
things,
centre.
good block of land, etc. But it's not about you.
It's not about me, but I was just establishing the bona fides of your colleague here.
Fair enough.
That's what I was doing, and I was looking for commonality.
Yeah.
It's what you do if you're very good at what you do for a living.
Clearly I'm not.
You engage and connect with people. What I find, that's what you guys do for a living. You've got to enjoy working with your clients, don't you?
Yeah. Well, that's why you're not someone that I work with regularly on that front.
Well, I don't.
Because I wouldn't enjoy that personally.
No, if I was going to actually use your
Aaron.
firm,
You already have.
He's trusted. He's trusted and respected.
Touche.
He's trusted and respected. But so it's not a small portfolio. It's not ridiculously large, but I'd say it's larger than most. Like, I don't know, how many sort of, if Aaron were a client of your property, where would he sit on
sub 5% of clients would sort of have more than, probably not. And again, you probably raised a good point earlier, Phil, where you sort of say, do you count the number of doors or number of assets, or know, the way Aaron opened up where his portfolio is, and is the way we like to always count it. It's irrelevant for us, typically the amount of properties, unless it's 1 or 2 very, very expensive properties. But for us, it probably comes down to saying that over 10 million in assets and 6.5 in debt. That's probably pushing towards a top 5% of clients that we have on the books. Irrespective of whether it's 14 assets or 5 assets or 25 assets, it starts to become, in a scenario, it starts to become very hard to figure out how do you get into that territory. Not even if you have the desire. It's how do you have the ability.
Well, I wanted to give some sense of that, because you've got to be careful sometimes, because if you have a large portfolio and you talk to other people with large portfolios, there's just an assumption that it's a normal portfolio.
Yeah.
What I wanted to frame was that it's not a normal portfolio. It's quite a sophisticated and large portfolio. But once upon a time, it was probably a small portfolio, right? You start off with 1 or 2 properties. So I guess the skill is how you've been able to manufacture what is now a sizable asset. Now, you're still a reasonably young bloke. You've probably still got couple of decades of work ahead of you, not to depress you, but but you've probably got good 2-3 market cycles in your working life.
Yeah, definitely.
And then whatever retirement looks like for you, and that 10.5 will quickly, by the time you finish, it'll be 30 point something, right? Yeah, and you sit there and think that's impossible. How's that going to work, right? But it will be. So even if you don't change your debt position right now, that's comfortable.
Yeah, it's a good. Yeah,
you're comfortable.
Well, especially considering cash flow is relatively neutralised, that's when you can say I'm pretty comfortable.
Even with interest rates as they are right now, it's
It's a bit negative at the moment.
Like $6.5 million in debt. That's costing you a few shekels every year.
It's costing a bit.
Yeah.
We were sort of able to restructure the home mortgage, move that over to the investments, because we've sort of found that most of the debt that we had against the principal place had all been used for deposits and costs on investments. So that was, from a tax planning perspective, that was the smartest way to structure it. So I guess sort of theoretically, I'm still carrying a bit of debt on the family home, but it's just been structured in a more effective
But you think about,
way.
well, it's a really good point, and you must have a good accountant, because all of that debt sitting in your investment properties means that it's tax deductible.
Correct.
If that was sitting in your principal place of residence, you get no benefits from it at all. So that's
exactly
smart bananas.
Yeah.
You would think. But so what's going to happen in your portfolio? Is that it? You said you're still in accumulation phase. Like, how much more is there to do?
Yeah, look, I think any time I see value, I'll just jump on it. There's a couple of properties there where there's significant development upside. So there's medium to high density zoning. There's a small acreage up in Queensland, up in that sort of Caboolture region that's 2 acres. May get rezoned to a medium density, I think next generation zoning in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
I think the zoning scheme there allows for, I think it's 15 to 75 dwellings per hectare. So that could conceivably be a 30 or 40 townhouse site at some point. Whether or not I even think about trying to do that myself, I don't know yet. I could hand it off to someone else and reinvest the proceeds in a unit block or a good quality commercial, maybe multi-tenanted commercial asset. I'll just make that call as it comes. But
So you've got a lot of optionality.
Correct.
And that's a good thing to have.
Yeah.
But you're not paying a premium for that optionality. So the point being that your portfolio is negatively geared, but it's not onerously negatively geared as a result of potentially capitalising on optionality.
Yeah.
Should have, could have, can do in the future.
Yeah.
So how do you go about building a portfolio like that, whereas most people get sort of stuck to, at best, 3 to 5 properties?
I think it's usually making quick decisions and always being conscious that it's a numbers game and buying the sorts of properties that a lot of people will shy away from. So I think when I was first started building the portfolio, maybe 2011, 2012, I think my first 5 properties were just little units and townhouses. I hear a lot of people say, you stay away from the units and townhouses because of the strata and, they can't be any more than what they are. They're not upside. Well, I see units having huge upside because they're usually in the affordable price points. Some of the units that I've seen even in the Perth market in the last 2 or 3 years have easily outperformed the freestanding houses. And I'd probably add to say that a lot of clients could have enhanced their position a lot more by sometimes jumping on some of these opportunities rather than just insisting on freestanding houses on blocks of land.
Is that from a point of holding your portfolio, so like maybe pigeon pairing better yielding properties, which may be units in Perth, I don't know the market, to offset
Correct.
whole costs elsewhere?
And to be able to, I think from what Paul was saying about doing these strategy sessions, I think one of the biggest areas I see people get stuck is they've got 2 or 3 freestanding houses and they might be very well bought, but it's usually that time they get to 3, the banks cut them off. The cash flow just isn't there. I was looking at, I was securing properties in the last 2 or 3 years in Perth, villas within, 20 Ks from the capital city for 220,000. Those properties would now cost 420,000. So the clients who bought the house for 450, that's worth 600. So that's a great result on paper. But 2 of those $220,000 villas would be worth 800 today, as opposed to say, 600. Plus the rents would be say 950 to 1,000 a week combined, as opposed to say 630 a week for the house. So in a high rate environment where the bank is quite restrictive, the person with those units or villas, whatever the case may be, they're going to be in a position to keep expanding their asset base. Yeah. So it's those little sort of pivotal points, and I can sort of relate that to my experience having only bought units for the first 5 properties and only buying a freestanding property at property number 6, which I think was in Brisbane from memory.
So you kicked off in western suburbs of Sydney, your portfolio?
Yeah, a bit of Campbelltown, North Parramatta.
And you're buying units?
Townhouse, unit, villa, all of those
all
sorts
that stuff.
things.
Sounds familiar, Philip.
Yeah, I've only bought 2 units, I think.
Were they the first?
On the smart property investment portfolio, there's 2 units in a townhouse. So
maybe the areas might be
Mount Druitt,
similar.
A couple of units in Mount Druitt, which we still have, and a townhouse up in
Logan. There you go.
Up in Logan.
They've sort of in the background.
Been fine.
But and we've spoken about this plenty of times in different contexts. But if you were going to go buy property now, would it be those properties? No. But it comes down to how to start and how to keep going. And I think to your point, Aaron, is that you start where you can start and you buy what you're able to buy. And to your point again, Aaron, if you get to the point of having 3 freestanding houses, yes, they could be great assets. Cash flow might be a little bit skinny. Bank says, well, that's it for you, unless you go down this pathway. But that's when sometimes people are at that fork in the road where they're reluctant to say, okay, well, I'll go that way, and that's still going to allow me to push forward. And your portfolio is a gleaming example of the fact that, yes, you are going to meet these barriers multiple times. You're going to get a bank's going to say no unless you go down this pathway, and you say, okay, well, that's where I'm going to go, and I'm going to find those opportunities that fit what you're able to lend me to buy. And that's not just in one market. To your point, you're buying properties in Perth at the moment. You bought in Sydney, you've bought in Brisbane, you've bought in Melbourne, you've bought in Adelaide, you've bought in Perth in your own portfolio, in some cases multiple times in different cycles as well. It's probably more of a story of just keep pushing, buy what you're able to buy, and also having a broker who's prepared to keep pushing the envelope and keep giving you options, regardless of whether it's mainstream lenders or third-tier, very expensive money.
Well, I think, you speak, I think, that's really bad language, but a lot of investors get the jitters with debt at a point in time, and everyone talks about why people didn't buy more when they could have. Part of it is serviceability, but part of it is because people feel as though they want to de-risk against holding too much debt. And then you speak to property investors with larger portfolios, these sort of top 5%, and they've all got the mantra, take as much debt as you possibly can when you can. If you're fiscally capable enough to be able to manage that debt, it's when people find themselves in problems where they can't manage their own finances. So you're obviously embracing that mantra, as in take as much as you possibly can and be comfortable with a period of redlining to capitalise on the benefits. Like, and you own your family home, right? You're not cross-collateralised or anything like that, are you? No, they can't come knocking on your door to take your family home.
No, that's all been restructured. So
see, that's smart. You've probably got to guarantee loans and stuff. I don't know. But you invest in trusts and all that sort of thing.
A lot in personal names and a family trust as well. Just working on getting the self-managed super set up to buy something else as well. I've been sort of neglecting that for a while. It's probably one of the final pieces of the puzzle. But
which where a lot of people we spoke about. You sort of trade quite actively inside of your self-managed super fund, whereas a lot of people forget outside the scope of this. But you spoke about units and units having value. It's really funny over the last. Maybe people might not agree with what I'm about to say, but the proliferation of buyers agents recently has sort of demonised apartment ownership. I'm just sort of speaking off the cuff where, a lot of people now go, don't buy apartments. And if you look at the numbers, and you're probably close to this, Paul, I'm not talking about you guys, by the way, but the disparity of price points between, I'm talking about Sydney apartments and freestanding houses, has just grown rapidly. So if you look at numbers, you would look and sit there and go, apartments haven't been keeping up with price growth. So there's got to be a normalisation back to the way it should normally be with apartments versus houses. And it's a big gap at the moment. Yeah. So I think a lot of people are actually starting to see in Sydney, for example, value in apartments. I don't know, is that a fair call?
It is, and I'm actively looking at those deals at the moment. So one of those recent ones, we've got a client who's, I think, about to settle on a unit in Bankstown, 1-bedroom unit, 310,000. Last traded, I think, in about 2015 for about 345,000.
Okay.
So you look at the growth in residential property over the past few years, particularly with COVID. How many areas have actually gone backwards, within a capital city that's walking distance from the new metro line?
So so these deals exist.
This is today.
This is,
As we speak.
How much?
310,000.
15K Sydney CBD. What's the rent on it?
It will rent for 400.
400.
So it'll be a 6.5% gross yield.
So you pretty much cover yourself, to
Almost.
hold it.
Yeah.
And at 310, that's only got to go. See, and this is back to the point, talking politics, for example, this idea of going, it's impossible to buy a home in Sydney for young people. No, it's not.
No.
Go and buy a one-bedroom place.
5% deposit.
5%
closing
deposit.
costs.
You're in there.
You're in there for 30 grand.
And that's not...
So you can actually have home ownership
For 30 grand.
in
save.
Bankstown?
Bankstown.
Walking
15
distance
Ks
to
in the CBD. Walking
middle
distance to the
ring.
new metro line, middle ring location within the biggest city in this country.
And it's not a studio. It's a 90-something square metre.
So it's not.
It's bigger than most two-bedders. It's got a separate storage room. The old sort of 70s block
Is it
of
like a
30
blonde brick
Yeah,
type thing?
I'd say, yeah.
Yep.
So
that's crazy.
They're still there.
Yeah, they're there. And hot tip, there's some of the options that
Is there a lot there, or you got to hard to find?
Within certain LGAs,
Yeah.
yes, the opportunities in that, even in that 400 sort of low fours, they rent for 500 a week. So numbers are quite similar.
1-bedroom apartment,
Two-bedroom will get you 400 will get you a 2-bed.
close to amenities, close to transport. There's a new metro going in. I mean, you know Bankstown pretty well. You used to work at sport scene. That's whatever it
Yes.
was. Yeah. But do you think it matters, the fact that you know the area well? Like, does that help you see value?
Not necessarily. I think it can even be a bit of an attribute to not have the preconceived ideas about areas.
Yeah.
And often the feedback I get from clients when I'm presenting them with a deal.
You're answering this exactly as I expected you to answer, by the way.
he was an advisor.
It was loaded. That was a really loaded question.
Loaded
Sorry. Sorry to interrupt you.
Is that yes, we've got we've spoken to our friends in Perth or Brisbane, and they've told us this is a terrible area to invest, and at the end of the day, you're not going to be living in the property. It all comes down to the numbers, how it's going to fit into your portfolio. And I mean, I always say my old man was chief of detectives in Campbelltown in the mid-90s.
Ooh.
And when I told him I was buying in Minto, he nearly fell off his chair.
Yeah.
And but I said, look, the numbers work. I can afford this. This is a unit for 179 grand. I can't buy a house because that was 300. This is back in 2011 when interest rates were 7.5%, 8%. So that was just too much for me at the time. And that was the area I could afford, and it was the type of asset I could afford.
Do you still hold that asset?
Still got it.
And you actually
Minto.
call it the right way, Minnow?
Minnow, yeah.
It is pronounced Minto these days.
It's Look, probably. So what was a 1-bedroom apartment in Minto?
So two better.
Two better?
Yeah, smallish two better.
What's it worth today?
370.
Yeah,
Rents
okay.
for 400 a week.
Yeah, happy days.
So it's one of those little units that I still hold. I just call them the economy seats. They pay the bills. They tick over. They help me hold the larger development sites. And they're one day they may become redundant, and I'm going to transition the proceeds into something else. But for the moment, they still serve a purpose. So as long as they do, I'll keep them.
Yeah, that's smart. So, I've got to go back to the point that property investment is also accessible to most Australians, which are fiscally responsible and sensible and have full-time work and are able to secure debt.
Yeah.
Like 300, I'm blown away. 310 grand in Bank sounds like a booming place. And there's other places in Sydney like that. But I think it was even slated today as one of those areas of huge economic uplift over time. It's you're not going to go too wrong with it.
And these are areas that are on, I'd say, underdeveloped blocks as well. So there's definite, they're probably zone R4. So there's upside there for, future development as well. And
if you
good
get
land
someone to
value.
club up and try and get 30 buyers or 70% of the body corporate, it's pretty hard going, but these things happen. Okay. But you're not buying those things anymore, personally?
Look, if I find them, I'll still buy them.
Yeah.
And I always think...
And banks are happy to lend against that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I probably would have bought that banks down one myself, but I couldn't turn around a 10-day cooling off around Christmas time was probably a bit tight.
Yeah.
So I ended up buying something else in Perth, but I would have jumped on that myself.
Yeah. Would you buy that stuff, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in certain properties and certain structures that might fulfill a gap, like SMSF, typically it might be a need that comes in. I've got a little bit of spare change in the SMSF with maybe limited borrowing for a certain wedge of cash.
Yeah.
For me, probably if I'm just going down that SMSF pathway, sometimes if you've got liquidity, last thing I want in my SMSF is cash.
Yeah.
And that's the part which I'm like, if there's spare cash that is, once I pass asset requirements, I want to get rid of any other cash that sits in there because it's useless. That's the part which I'd probably consider that in my own portfolio at this stage. And I'm still actively trying to find probably one or two more in my own SMSF for the next 6 months to fulfill some of those gaps.
So investing inside your sovereign super fund to buy that particular asset, call it a 2-better at 400. What do you need to play?
20%.
Yeah.
Plus, call it 5% closing costs. So $100,000 in your SMSF would get you that asset with a $300,000 debt against it.
And you still pay land tax inside of your self-managed super fund?
Good question.
Some holding costs. It
Depends on where it's located.
Yeah.
So it's not technically falling straight into a trust structure like it would be for New South Wales.
Yeah, I haven't really ever thought about this.
Yeah, so you do get get some concessions, but again, like obviously your super fund's paying those holding costs.
Yeah.
And that is obviously a much more tax-effective vehicle as well. So there's even if there is taxes that are incurred, obviously you can pay from within the super fund as well. So there's certain benefits that sit there.
Getting a bit micro, but so you're happy with where everything's at? What would you do differently if you had time again?
Probably wouldn't have sold a couple of things that I sold. So one of the earlier deals, which is probably similar to what you would have bought sort of back in the day, we bought a house in Penrith, I think back in about 2012, which I think was a mortgagee in possession. Bought it for about, I think, $227, something like that. Did a $30K reno, sold it for $330, walked away with about $35 after tax. Thought I was the world's foremost expert on renovation. And then I check a few years later, the guy who bought it from me for $330,000 sold it 4 years later for $610. So then I'm the chump. So
yeah, you did a lot of hard work.
I learnt pretty quickly that it's always the next guy that makes the money out of the renovation.
Yeah.
And I've always found, paying to have something that's already renovated, sometimes the market will do the work for you rather than you actively trying to improve things.
Yeah, so, a mate of mine, you know him, did a big sort of development of a property in sort of inner suburb of Sydney, inner west, and did a really nice house and all that sort of stuff. I can't remember what he did, a full reno, like a big structural
heritage restoration.
Yeah. And his next door neighbour. So they sort of sold at similar times, and next door neighbour got the same price he got from what he did, and he did all the hard work on the reno. So the market did the majority of the heavy lifting, but he actually had the upsides of living in a nice house as the principal place residence for a period of time. What you don't get a lot of these days versus when we sort of kicked off investing, and probably what you're talking about there, is that people are like, I'm going to find someone to renovate and I'm going to manufacture equity by doing a really smart renovation. You don't get a lot of that at the moment because doing renos at the moment is hard work. It's expensive, takes longer than it traditionally would have because of access to labour. You're not getting the return on investment in renos at the moment. Is that a fair call?
It's probably a really, really astute call right now, Phil. And I think probably, if anything, that's become really bleedingly obvious over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, is that throughout the end of COVID and through this high inflation period, both for labour and also for materials and holding costs now for interest rates when you've got a property vacant. That's the thing that has changed completely. It's literally flipped a 180 within that short period of time where you just can't find anything that's justifiable when you see something that's got warts on it, unless you are in the trade game. And even then, you still don't really have much advantages because your time's still worth what it's worth. Materials are still worth what they're worth. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, the renovated property versus the unrenovated property, you almost can't really put a number to a lot of these things these days. So what it's come down to is there is certainly going to be more value in buying properties which are tenant ready, unless it's things as simple as a lick of paint, new curtains and flooring and tidying up the yards, things that you can physically control within a week. Outside of that, there's not much value.
Because the supply and demand equation, like you pretty much rent anything, even if it's got hairs on it now, you rent it because of
almost
the
every
way
major market is
so it doesn't
similar
make sense to actually
Correct.
try and tweak another $20 a week out of something by spending a few bucks on it because of the market. So,
and to give away your capital, probably that's how the big thing too is that what most people don't really do their math on is that if you're buying a $400,000 asset and comparables in the street are selling for $520, let's say hypothetically as a nice freshly renovated property, you might look at it and say, look, I can tip 50 grand cash, has to be cash, or borrowed money from another asset into that property, then maybe get it revalued at $520, and I can maybe take out a portion of that equity uplift. Yeah, there might be, and I'm just using fictitious numbers there, but then all of a sudden you lose that 50K that you would have otherwise tipped into that property, let alone the holding costs and all your borrowing capacity as well. So you're kind of also gambling on the fact that you're going to tip this money in and that the bank's going to be willing to get you that money back out plus some extra. So you're kind of taking the risk on getting rid of your liquidity. And one thing you've probably learned this too, Aaron, by building a large portfolio progressively over time is you got to treat liquidity like it is the last bit of cash you'll ever have, because once you get rid of it, there's no guarantee you can get that back out, whether it's via an equity redraw or by saving more money, etc. So that's one thing I'm very, very conscious of when we're talking to clients is, look, we don't want to put any money into that property that's unnecessary, because all of a sudden you're left with, hey, I want to build this portfolio to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 assets. Once you give it away, how do we get that back without losing control? And control is a big part of building a property portfolio. Is if you lose it, sometimes it's hard to figure out how do you get it back.
So now more than ever before, it's market and asset selection rather than this idea of manufacturing equity. There's still a game to play there, but I think
it's later year, and I think we've got to go through some big changes, and that won't change overnight. We know that. Yeah, that's probably 2, 3, 4 years, maybe at a minimum, before we find this equilibrium of labour getting cheaper, materials becoming sustainably cheaper over a period of time, being predictably saying, I spend X, I get Y. Right now, I mean, I couldn't think of the last time you or I, Aaron, have spoken to a client saying, let's find a property that's dilapidated and tip some money into it and we'll get an equity uplift. We haven't had that conversation about even thinking about it.
So most of the stuff you're finding, you can put tenants in tomorrow.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily
with
just the
minor
property.
works. With tidy up, yard tidy up, patch painting.
Yeah. Having good tradies on our books as far as handyman and the true definition of an all-rounder, just to say, look, go in there, quote us up on X, Y, and Z. I'll come back with a quote saying I can whip this out.
Do you have guys that just exclusively work for
Absolutely.
you? Yeah,
absolutely.
All over the joint? Or?
In every major market, which we're going to buy multiple assets within a relatively concise.
Do you set that up first?
Constraint.
Like if you start entering the market, do you find some local that can? Because it gives you greater confidence, I guess, of getting outcome for your clients.
Yeah, and I can think of probably 3 or 4 handyman or tradespeople that we use in certain markets, but sometimes it's more specific because it might be just, hey, we've got a property manager who has a couple of good people on their books, but if we're in a larger market and we're buying a bit more of a bulk type of asset, I can think in Queensland we've probably got 1 or 2 who do a lot of work. They've done work for me. I know they've probably done work for yourself, Aaron, done other work for actual our buyers agents who are buying investments, let alone huge amounts of our team. But Sydney was the same for a period of time. We certainly got these people in Perth at the moment. I know we had them back in Hobart and Launceston when we were buying a lot in those markets. So yes, to answer your question, it's key, because even if we don't want to do it, we do want to quote, because also what we use with that quote is sometimes within our negotiation period, leverage on a building and pest report is sometimes key, because we might say, hey, let's X, Y, and Z. We flicked off that list from a building and pest report to our trusted building and pest, our handyman, and if they come back with it, sometimes we can even attach that to say, here's the quote. And what sometimes we get is not only may the vendor say we'll reduce the price by that amount, They might also say, look, we're happy to go and engage that handyman to actually go and carry out the work. So it kind of works regardless which way we're going on it. Whether we do the work, they do the work, we get a price reduction. They're things that we want to be confident when going through that process.
So what's the property in your portfolio, Aaron, you wish you didn't have?
There's probably, I've got a unit in a suburb called Albion in Melbourne. I bought it for, I think, $229 in 2014, and it's probably worth about $250 to $260.
Okay.
And I think it's the closest property to a property I wish I didn't have.
Yeah.
Because I think that inner Melbourne market is really going to move.
So it'll come good.
I think so. So I think I just put the rent up from $260 to $320. I'm starting to see rents go for those two bedders up to high threes, 400.
Yeah.
Those yields are not going to be there. So when in future months, when the interest rates come down at some point, the rents will go up, and I think those yields will compress. So I don't think you're going to be able to get a 7 or 8% gross rental yield on any sort of residential property in Melbourne for very long. So if that property is only worth, say, $250 today and the rent goes up to $400 a week, I think that tide will naturally lift the price of that asset.
So you compensated for lack of capital growth with positive cash flow.
With cash flow.
Yeah.
And they're always a bit out of sync. And I'm constantly questioning my own assumptions. And sometimes when I look at an asset and think, well, I don't like it, it hasn't done a lot for a while, I think back to the people that we've been buying properties from in, say, Perth, that have held properties for 10 to 12 years. And
do you feel like a burglar? Because I reckon you're probably buying for the same price as they paid 10 years ago, and they've just been holding these things with all the costs connected with it.
Yeah.
Do
Probably.
you feel good about it? How do you guys sleep at night?
You buy a lot of these properties, Philip. We're not buying them. We're just recommending
You're just
them.
recommending someone else.
You're the one signing the documents, sir.
No, I joke, but this is the point, around you got to buy the market, right? You got to buy you got to identify the market and buy the uplift, because it's really hard to manufacture.
And I think if I'm going to look at it in that way and think, well, just because I'm becoming a bit impatient after 10 years, am I just going to let go of an asset? I have to think of an owner of a property that might only own one property. Well, why do they only own one property? Because they're only thinking of it in a short-term way. They're not treating it as a business. And they're the kinds of people that fortunately or unfortunately we're buying properties from. And I have to remind myself when I get frustrated or tired of a property that it's always sort of darkest before the dawn. And sometimes, when you sell at that 10-year point, sometimes the prices are about to move. So, yes, there's properties that may have had a little bit of an opportunity cost, or maybe I've held them a bit too long, but they'll come good. And it's like I said, I bought it for $229. There's not a whole lot of debt on it. And it's one of those things, whenever I talk to the broker and say, should I get rid of this? Should I get rid of this? And they come back to me and say, it's not going to help your serviceability, because then you lose the rental income as well. So that kind of makes the decision.
And this issue also is that a lot of people think there's only one side of the ledger, right? If you're offloading, if you're offloading assets, you got to pay, unless depending on what entity or how you choose to hold it, you got to pay capital gains on it, but you're losing the income. So,
correct.
Often you're better holding on and keeping it and trying to maximise that and compensating for a period of, neutral capital growth. And that was, you probably got stuff as well. I started buying in Queensland in 2015, maybe, Brizzy and stuff, and that did nothing for ages.
Yeah.
I remember sitting there going, just sell this. Nothing's going on, right?
It didn't do anything until it did.
Didn't do anything, and then it did.
We waited, and
I would have been mad to have sold it. And I know people who sold on the same basis. I mean,
absolutely,
stuff this out of it, and they haven't benefited from significant substantial capital growth. Have you got anything in your portfolio that you wish you didn't have? Is there anything you hold on to that
I've sold a few properties, not last year, the year before, probably 2-3 assets in that year, which were properties that I was waiting for a time where, and it wasn't because I needed to, but it was more just I looked at them like, the market did its work, and I was like, I don't really plan on holding these long term, and it wasn't that I wanted to substitute them, and they were. To be fair, one was a villa that I had in Sydney that did really well for a short period of time, and it was on a sideways movement. I just like, it's time to get rid of that because I knew there was some extra work that had to happen to the property and the block for that matter. And there was 2 other properties in Queensland, same thing, which ended up offloading all 3 in the same financial year. Made a gain, but took that off the ledger. It was more just from a long-term sort of stitch in time saves 9 because I knew there was some body corp stuff that was coming up. Wasn't immediate, but it was going to come. And that was it. But at the moment, I've kind of intentionally right-sized the portfolio there. I think we spoke about the last podcast we did, Phil, which I sold a property which was a much larger commercial site which had an intention to develop it. But that was a red flag that we sold. And not that I wish I never did it because we made money and certainly learned some lessons, but I wouldn't have done that again if I had that presented to me today. I'd look at that very differently. But I think that what probably the main point that this raises when I think about it is with this Albion property you talk about, Aaron, is the cash flow not only immediately but long term when you get the feedback from your broker to say, well, if you sell it, you'll take a bit of debt off your balance sheet, but your cash flow goes from your serviceability, so you're in a net position that's the same. Buying with, and whilst we don't buy majority of the time for cash flow per se, when you're buying with a property, buying a property with a particular cash flow, which comes close, if not neutralises a particular cash flow position, if the rent can cover and service, it gives you time. It buys the ability to be patient. When a property is highly negatively geared, and you asked me this question earlier in the podcast, Phil, if I had $1.3 million, would I buy one property in Sydney or one property in Perth, or would I split it across 2? Making that decision to be pragmatic, to maybe split it across 2, which may be more cash flow neutral whilst not sacrificing growth, also gives me the ability to be patient. Because if the growth doesn't come in year 1, in 2015 in Brisbane, you waited 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and sold the property. And he didn't tell us, but he sold the property 3 years ago. He said, can you please stop sending me these emails? Now, unfortunately, he moved overseas and lost contact with us. We tried to obviously reach out to him quite regularly and wasn't necessarily stoked with the outcome because he sold the property. I think it was in mid-2020 or mid-2021. I can't remember the details, but I think he sold for about $380, recouped some of his expenses, maybe about 20 grand profit after all said and done. We did a review on the property. The value of the property at the time was about $620,000. Rents were about $550, $580 a week. The property doubled in value between 2016 and today, but he sold at a point in time where his patience just ran out and he moved overseas for work and essentially just forgot about property investing. That for me is a classic example to say, and we had a bit of a joke in that meeting at the time, buying property is not buying tech stocks. It's not buying cryptocurrency. It is not buying and thinking that if this doesn't work in 4 to 6 months, I'm out because it's a failure. Buying property is an investment in time, and cash flow most of the time does give you that investment in time as well. And I think that's a really good lesson for anyone who wants to build a larger property portfolio such as Aaron's is, whilst you're not buying it to gain a $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, $5,000 a year positive income the first few years, you're buying that income to give you patience to wait 2 decades because you know that's when the true money is made.
What do you like about working for Pure Property or with Pure Property or in Pure Property?
Just working with
clients. You see I've framed that as in, do you?
You can be honest though.
That's it. Why? Leadership is a bit how you go.
It's a good. I think we've got a really good sort of team environment. You know, we have our face-to-face meetings every week. We have a lot of fun. We enjoy working with clients. I really enjoy working with clients and seeing them get comfortable with investing, seeing them get comfortable about taking on debt, just seeing them grow in that way and sort of lose any fears that they might have had. I think that's really rewarding.
So you're often more of a mindset coach than a property coach in some ways. Yeah.
I didn't ever think of myself that way, but I guess with what I'm doing day to day with my own portfolio and with what I'm doing with my investing and working with clients, I guess you do gravitate towards that and not having the fear, and I guess being a bit of a mentor and a coach to people, and I take that quite seriously. And I like to see the results, especially when we get good feedback and, they're happy when a property's gone up in value or they've been able to get a good rental increase and, having those regular catch-ups and just seeing them really grow and, again, lose that fear.
Yeah. Is there any sort of internal competition in your business, like who can find the best property? Like, do you sit and go, I got this one, and people go, yeah. Does that happen?
It's probably that way. It's probably that way.
You know what I mean? Like people,
absolutely.
Like people hide stuff. Like, I don't want anyone else on this.
There's no incentive for us to push one way or the other for clients. I guess probably more what it's at though is that we do find it like from week to week. Because everyone reviews everything within our buyers agency team. When a property is presented at a price, we say, "What'd you get that for?" It's pretty unanimous. Immediately say that it's a good buy. Yeah. And when you do find those, it's kind of like it's a feel good feeling for everyone. To be honest,
it's a bit of friendly competition, right? I guess it's respect of the professionalism of what you do for a living. So everyone works their own beat of like agents and stuff, or like how do you?
I think so. I think we'd split it up amongst different agents. A lot of the time, it's different areas. But I mean, having said that, a lot of us have got expertise across a lot of different markets. Like I've bought hundreds in Brisbane, in that Moreton Bay region back in the day. Yeah. Not buying as much there now, obviously, but doing a lot in Perth, doing a lot in Sydney, a bit in Victoria. So sort of spread across a lot of different markets. But yeah, there's some good banter about who's getting the best deals, who's getting the most, and it can be. I think it's competitive, but in a healthy way. In that we're working as a team. We're not a group of your traditional sales agents office where we're all trying to steal each other's commissions and listings and all of that sort of thing. We're all working together as a common goal.
So when you get together and you sort of review properties, I guess red teaming, right? Does anyone ever go, what are you doing? You're a madman doing that deal. Like, do you sort of challenge it and
there'll be times
peer-reviewed type stuff?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the time property probably is discarded before it gets to the table. In that front, it's probably already gone past that point of seeing value. Like the conversation saying they just want too much. We just can't pay that. But there is times where we do challenge each other, or a property will come up and someone else might have already had some knowledge in that area saying, I paid X for Y only 2 months ago. I don't reckon that's value. Or potentially it's the opposite, saying I paid this for that a couple of months ago. If you can get it for that price, that's good buying. Or they've given you that rental appraisal, that's low. So probably that's probably they're lowballing, or they don't know the details. There's a lot of time where we sort of get a lot more group data out of those conversations as well.
And we might, one of us might have a listing from an agent who is potentially a bit out of area and they're looking at something.
You like them, don't you?
Oh,
yeah. I got my brother-in-law listed. He's from like 100 kilometres away, but he's a really good real estate agent.
Yeah, it's an old referral. But it might be in an area where, we've bought for clients 2.5 years ago for $275 and they're wanting $550 for it today. And we're thinking, look, it's still an affordable price point, but how much more upside is there in it? Yeah. So we're always questioning each other about that. But as Paul said, we each have our own filters and rarely does anything come to the table that hasn't been gone through a pretty rigorous process before we actually discuss it as a group.
Did you ever end up working on the same deal? Has that ever happened?
Not really. Hasn't for me.
No. I can't recall that ever happening.
So it's quite unique. Everyone sort of operates in a... Yeah.
Well, if an agent's speaking to more than two of us, we'll have known as well.
You'd know pretty quickly.
Yeah, because ultimately, this is the beauty about being very transparent with agents as well, is that they're not getting paid by us. So when they talk to us, that's how I already spoke to Lena about this one, but I don't know if you run those numbers on that one. And sometimes agents might try to be a little bit tricky, saying, I do remember distinctly from a few properties, one agent in particular, I won't name him, in the Brisbane market. I do remember he always used to call Lena from my team and then give me a call sometimes thereafter and say, I spoke to Lena about this and, she said you might have someone interested, and Lena would be next to me in the office saying, I told him that this is what we pay, and then all of a sudden he'd come back to me and say, you can get it for X, which is like 20 grand above what we already had a discussion about, but not disclosing those conversations. But the beauty about it is saying, look, leave it with me, mate, I'll have a chat. But most of the time, agents know that, hey, if you've spoken to someone and given them a price, don't come back and tell me a different price because we've already told you what we're going to pay.
Sort of connected to all this. You cross what happened in America recently with
with the buyer's agent side of things, which is not surprising because that was a racket from day dot.
So 6%. So the vendor pays
for everything,
6%
for everything,
and it got split, half of it to the vendor's agent, and the other half or thereabouts to the buyer's agent, but not a buyer's agent. The buyer's agent get paid a commission from the vendor. So
Correct.
Congress has gone.
And a lot of the time it was the same agency who was listing the property, finding the buyer, and essentially charging 6%. It's wild. But the same principle makes all of the margin.
Yeah, they reckon a lot of real estate agents in America can't even operate on what they're getting paid right now. The average commissions in Sydney, in Australia, is about 1.6 to 2%. Right? Like, I reckon it's going to just decimate the real estate industry. I don't know, any ramifications for Australia while I've got you here?
Well, it's never been. I mean, and this is the beauty about, and I think it's probably a good lesson because there was a time, I think personally, being in this industry for a decade, there was a time where there was some consideration, I think, and there was no doubt a lot of the big agents across Australia were probably thinking, do we open up our own buyer's agency internally? And I think that this could be opportunity for them to say, hey, look, here's probably what will happen if that goes that way. Because it doesn't take a genius to figure out to say that is a conflict of interest if you've got an agent representing both sides of the ledger. Unless the actual commission remains the same and the agent chooses to split it out however they choose to. But when you start saying, well, we'll add in an extra commission for the sake of finding a buyer, that's a selling agent's job.
If your buyer's agent's getting a cut of the commission from the vendor, they're not a buyer's agent,
They are
right?
not a buyer's agent. And hence why, for I was saying a second ago, is that's why it's easy for us to be very, very cutthroat when we speak to selling agents, is that, look, you either give the price or not. But
do you ever get offered like, hey, look, help us to get this deal done and there's a drink for you? The agents,
from time to time, there's been those conversations.
Really?
But look, I won't name names,
No,
but it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy
Yeah.
for us to obviously rule that out. But conjunctions per se, they might call it a conjunction, where they'll say, look, if you get a buyer for this at this price, I'll split the commission with you, or I'll give you a percentage of commission. You're like, man, we get paid by our buyers. It's pretty simple. That's it. It's simple. We buy a property.
Do you think real estate agents actually understand what a buyer's agent does? I know it's one of the great manufacturers of the new generation of buyer's agents, selling agents who go, I'm sick of selling and hustling for deals. But do you reckon most real estate agents know what buyer's agents do, or they know the rules of engagement?
I don't. Well, the problem is I think majority of them probably who work in the owner-occupier spaces, sort of north of $1 million, it's a completely different rule of engagement, in my opinion, because most of them in that space will be charging a percentage of purchase price. And for us, it's never been a position that we're comfortable with. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, what we're trying to say is that, hey, we charge a flat fee. The work that we do for a $286,000 unit block or an apartment versus a $400,000 or $800,000 or $900,000 freestanding house elsewhere, the work ultimately is the same, and the charge that we go through is the same. So what we get paid is the same. When it becomes a percentage, I feel like there's a bit more, hey, get them up for me, would you? Because I know they'll sell at this price. Okay, leave it with me. I'll get them up on price. That conversation doesn't happen with us because we're not selling on emotion. We're not buying on emotion. We're buying on numbers because we buy investment properties. Yeah. But I think real estate agents, if you ask them the eastern suburbs of Sydney as an example, I'd say you get a very different answer to if you go ask a sales agent who is selling property in Mandurah, Western Australia. Their perception of what a buyer's agent does, I think, would be poles apart, personally speaking.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, you sort of frame of reference is property investment. So it's very different to someone, paying for a buyer's agent to buy them a $10 million property, right?
Exactly. And some people might be comfortable paying a percentage and say, look, if you can just get it for me, I'm happy to pay whatever it costs. And fair play. If that's all disclosed and it's upfront, then that's not our space.
It's a disclosure thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, we digress.
I think real estate, to add to that, I think real estate agents are increasingly aware of buyer's agents now. And if I look at the areas we're investing in, they want to deal with us. So they don't want to have 30 inquiries from people who are sending in offers loaded with special conditions and due diligence clauses.
Yeah, all you guys
but
do
they know
we're
legit. I mean, that's the part, which is that if you're a deal, like we're a buyer, here's our purchase.
Well, essentially, you're an aggregator of buyers.
That's exactly
what
we
you are.
Curate it and say, we'll get it done. Here's the conditions that we need to get it done at, and they'll say, okay, great. But having the confidence to know that our buyers are going to buy the property and follow through with it just means that they take away all of the unknowns.
That said, though, it's not hard to sell real estate in. Agent's going to hate me for saying this, but it's not hard to sell real estate in Perth at the moment.
No.
Yeah, but they've had a hard 10 years, right? Like with very so
absolutely.
Yeah, it's good days for them. But so I would rather, but personally, if I was a real estate agent in Perth, I'd rather sell money. I'd rather sell properties not to buyer's agent in this market. I'd be beefing it up to get direct to market investors in there. Like,
you raised some good points.
It must be hard for you guys to even get a seat at the table now. They're going to go, nah, I can get these guys over here. He's going to pay more anyway.
Particular off market, that's the biggest challenge. Is that whilst there's debates about property being advertised or not, and does that get you the best deal or not? Agents in particular, that's a business card for them. So they want to see themselves online. They want to see themselves in as much media as they can because they want to get the next listing from that advertising. And I can list off basically every market we've bought in over the last decade, from Sydney to Melbourne to Geelong to West Brisbane, North Brisbane, Hobart, Launceston, Devonport, Burnie, Adelaide, over towards Perth, down south of Perth. When we were buying in there in particular points in time, no one was buying there. So to buy a property off market, very, very simple.
Yeah.
Because agents say, look, I've got 1 million properties on my books, take your pick. And you essentially figure out what's going to be value or not, and they want to get that deal done. This day and age, you have to have very good contacts. And that's why having and nurturing these relationships with agents is extremely important because
you'd be mad. You'd be mad as an agent in Perth right now to be selling stuff off market. Like, what would be the rationale for it, unless it's super distressed?
Shut up.
But so the point is, can you find off-market stuff in Perth still?
I'll let Aaron answer this, and I'll preface this by saying I guess out of the last 100 properties we've bought in Perth / south of Perth or near around Perth, Aaron, how many have been advertised in the last out of the last 100 that you can think of?
Oh, a handful. You can count them on one hand.
Okay, there you go.
And a lot of the time they've got tenants in there. And tenants at a low rent as well. Yeah. Because a lot of the competition we're facing is from owner-occupiers. So if we can find a property where, even though the rent might be low, if there's a tenancy in place with 6 or 9 months to go on the lease, the owner-occupiers are just not interested. So straight away, you're knocking out 70 to 80% of your competition. So I think that's one of the ways.
So you need investors who are happy with taking a haircut on rent for a period of time to reset it to market rent at a point in time.
Correct. Yeah. I think you just buy.
So this is relevance. So there is still relevance for off the plan stuff, right? Because they don't want to market that. Off market. Yeah.
So they're very different.
Off market. So there is still.
So they might, like we had.
Or they don't want the tenants to know about it, or you always got to advise. I don't know what the rules are in Perth, but
we had one recently where. We knew about the property. They said, look, it's going to go to open home on the weekend. It did go to open home. They did have a fair bit of interest, but the interest was all from owner-occupiers, and it had a lease in place until about December. So this was in February. So most of these potential buyers are going to look at that and say, well, I want to move in now. I'm not waiting 7 months. Yeah. So essentially, and that place, to be fair, wasn't rented particularly below market. I think we could have got maybe 580, 600, and it was getting 540. So that was actually not too bad as far as being under rented. But I find that most sellers, maybe going back to what I said before, they only own one property. They're not professional investors. They've got properties rented out to mates or family at handshake arrangements. And I always say that to clients is that expect that 80% of properties we send to you are not going to be rented at market rates because, one, they're not going to be selling it if it's paying for itself, and two, they're not going to be selling it to us for the price that we're getting it at as well. Yeah. So it's par for the course.
Okay. Well explained. That makes sense. All right. Well, mate, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
That's okay. My pleasure.
Keep doing all the work.
Yeah.
Do you have like a leaderboard at Pure Property?
There's no leaderboards.
HQ that says Aaron's always at the top, finding the best properties?
We're a team.
No?
Yeah,
there's no I in team?
The only leaderboard is the footy tipping.
That is it.
On which I'm very middle of the pack with that.
Likewise.
Well, you be a Campbelltown
Dogs.
supporter?
Dogs. I'm a dog supporter.
Dogs. Yeah. You and ScoMo Sharks?
No.
I hear that you're the second number 2 ticket holder there at Shark Park.
I am
ScoMo.
a season ticket holder, but I still barrack for the mighty West Magpies, now the West Tigers.
West Tigers.
As a Campbelltown junior myself, that is the space.
Did you see that the state government's chosen not to fund the development of Leichhardt?
Yes.
Yeah.
They axed the funding of the development of the Shark Park precinct a couple of years ago as well. So they're on the nose within a few voting LGAs.
Yeah, there's enough money down in there. I've seen Shark Park. There's enough dough down there.
Well, as long as they don't keep selling off the assets.
Yeah.
Geez,
Right.
let's not get into that.
So, I can't remember your phone number.
1300 985 428, Philip.
Okay, you need a jingle.
Okay.
That's your homework.
Next.
I want a jingle. Can you give me a jingle?
We'll play it on air live next time round. Yeah,
you
sure.
do that. And can you say if someone contacts you guys going,
yep,
I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to talk to Aaron, can you request that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How do you do that?
Exactly as you did.
Oh, okay. So I don't want to talk to Paul Glossop.
Well, if you call up, then you'll speak to one of our team members and they'll organise a time to catch up with either Aaron or myself. But if you go online via our website, via purepropertyinvestment.com, hit the inquire now, the calendar will give options for either Aaron's calendar or my calendar. But ultimately, it's going to go through a relatively similar, rigorous regime of here's what we need to know, here's how we're going to set that criteria, and here's going to be essentially what we're going to be looking for.
So if someone books a time to chat with you guys, obviously it doesn't cost anything in that, but does someone tell them what they need to do to make the conversation worthwhile?
Usually we'll have a bit more of a preamble to try and figure out how to make sure it's more pointed, whether it's what level of finance are we at, what's the budget, are we ready to go now, or is it going to be 3 to 6 months, is there anything else we need to know as far as the existing portfolio? Usually we try to grab most of that information as much as possible. It just makes our conversation a lot more pointed. We can do pre-work before we catch up. So say, okay, look, here's what I know. I might fill in some gaps, and then we can then set a bit more of a strategy based on that information, and then look at which market's going to fulfill.
So what happens if someone has a chat with you guys and they go, yeah, I like the sound of this?
Yep.
What do they do then?
So typically from there we say, okay, well, look, if finance is indicatively approved and we know we can get X amount of funding, then the job that we have then is that once we have the criteria agreed and they're saying you're happy with that criteria, our job is to then say, look, we're going to be getting a briefing. So our buyers agents team get briefed as to exactly what we're looking for, and then it's over to us.
So it's a formal assignment saying, yeah, I want to do something.
Exactly,
okay.
Yeah. So typically out of that meeting, we'll have a formal agreement. If that agreement gets signed, say, yep, happy to proceed based on the strategy and the criteria that's been outlined, then it's over to us to really get busy in the field to go through inspections, negotiations, due diligence, and that's the hard part.
So the hardest thing for you guys probably, and I'll conclude with this chat, this question is, like, not all properties represent good investment properties. So if I sort of have a chat with you guys or the team and go, yeah, I want to do something, is there, like, do you sit behind other people who have preference or priority over you? Like,
no.
How does that work?
The criteria, and Aaron, you'll be able to speak to your specific examples, but the criteria that we're setting are just, they're never going to be carbon copy. There's always going to be a nuance between whether it's a yield, whether it's a location, whether it's a price point, whether it's a property type, whether it's diversification, whether it's going to be development upside or set and forget SMSF versus buying an investment, something that you want large land for a splitter block, so on and so forth. We just don't have here's what everyone should be buying within that budget. It's always going to vary and differ depending on the individual criteria.
Cool. All right. Well, that's the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop.
And Aaron Findlay.
Thanks, gents. Thanks for coming in.
Appreciate it.
Good to see you. Keep at it.
Yeah.
I might be in touch. Find me another one of these apartment blocks.
I'll try.
Yeah. They exist. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. You can go on just their website, purepropertyinvestment.com. There you go. Or find them on the social media if that's how you want to contact people. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.